Hello, and welcome to Chautauqua. Chautauqua is a program where scholars and actors perform first-person accounts of famous people in history. The unusual name comes from Lake Chautauqua, New York, where the first Chautauqua was held in 1874. It began as a training course for Sunday school teachers, but it grew into a traveling roadshow where politicians, lecturers, and performers brought information and entertainment to cities and towns across the nation. Today, Chautauqua is a humanities program where audiences watch scholars and actors perform on stage in full costume. By the end of the program, you will have learned a great deal about the history surrounding the character's life by just watching and listening to the performance. Our theme is Voices from the Great War. The famous person being portrayed tonight is a Ph.D. sociologist, author, editor, and activist for the civil and political rights of oppressed minorities. Tonight's Chautauqua character is the prolific William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. I'm Angela Rice Beamer at the Germantown campus of Montgomery College. Stay with us.
William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. Du Bois, not Du Bois. Du Bois. We are returning from the war. The crisis and tens of thousands of black men were drafted into a great struggle for bleeding France and what she means and has meant and will mean to us and humanity, and against the threat of German race arrogance, we fought gladly and to the last drop of blood. For America and her highest ideals, we fought in far-off hope. For the dominant Southern oligarchy entrenched in Washington, we fought in bitter resignation. For the America that represents and gloats in lynching, disfranchisement, caste, brutality, and devilish insult. For this, in the hateful upturning and mixing of things, we were forced by vindictive fate to fight also. But today, we return. We return from the slavery of uniform, which the world's madness demanded us to don, to the freedom of civil garb. We stand again to look America squarely in the face and call a spade a spade. We sing, this country of ours, despite all its better souls have done and dreamed, is yet a shameful land. It lynches us. And lynching is barbarism of a degree of contemptible nastiness unparalleled in human history. Yet, for 50 years, we have lynched 2 Negroes a week, and we have kept this up right through the war. It disfranchises its own citizens. Disfranchisement is the deliberate theft and robbery of the only protection of poor against rich, black against white. The land that disfranchises its citizens and calls itself a democracy lies and knows that it lies. It encourages ignorance. It has never really tried to educate the Negro. A dominant minority does not want Negroes educated. It wants servants, dogs, whores, monkeys. And when this land allows a reactionary group by its stolen political power to force as many black folk into categories as it possibly can, it cries in contemptible hypocrisy. They threaten us with degeneracy. They cannot be educated. It steals from us. It organizes industry to cheat us. It cheats us out of our land. It cheats us out of our labor. It confiscates our savings. It reduces our wages. It raises our rent. It steals our profit. It taxes us without representation. It keeps us consistently and universally poor, and then feeds us on charity and derides our poverty. Then it insults us. It has organized a nationwide and latterly a worldwide propaganda of deliberate and continuous insult and defamation of black blood wherever found. It decrees that it shall not be possible in travel nor residence, work nor play, education nor instruction for a black man to exist without tacit or open acknowledgement of his inferiority to the dirtiest, lowest dog. And it looks upon any attempt to question or even discuss this dogma as arrogance, unwarranted assumption, and treason. This is the country to which we, soldiers of democracy, return. This is the fatherland for which we fought. But it is our fatherland. It was right for us to fight. The faults of our country are our faults. Under similar circumstances, we would fight again. But by the God of heaven, we are cowards and jackasses if now that that war is over, we do not marshal every ounce of our brain and brawn to fight a sterner, longer, and more unbending battle against the forces of hell here in our own land. We return. We return from fighting. We return fighting. Make way for democracy. We saved it in France, and by the great Jehovah, we will save it here in the United States of America, or know the reason why. "39 years ago, when I was 51 years old, I wrote this piece in the Crisis magazine for the NAACP. May 1919. And that was after the war was over. In 1919, we were getting ready for peace. In February of that year, President Woodrow Wilson had written up a 14-point plan of peace to take to the Versailles Conference in France and present it to the nations, giving democracy to all of those nations that had been vanquished in the war. All of those nations in the Balkans and in Poland and in Austria that we had vanquished and reorganized and redistributed, and he had a 14-point plan to bring them democracy. Well, I thought, that is a good idea. Take them the democracy that we are practicing here in our own land. But then I sent him a letter, and I said, President Wilson, you do know that there are people over there where you're going who understand that the democracy that you're trying to pawn off on them, you're not practicing here. So before you go, why don't you try a little of that democracy on the Negro in this land of ours? He didn't answer my letter. I knew he wouldn't. But I had another plan. I was not going to let the President of the United States go over there in a war that Negroes had helped to fight and win and speak away our chances, our opportunity. So I wanted to go with him and watch him. Well, I was editor of the Crisis magazine, and he was carrying a press corps with him, and I decided that I wanted to be a part of the press corps since I was, in fact, a part of the press. And so I went to Joel Spingard, who was working with the Army now, and Emmett Scott, who also was working with the Army. Emmett Scott used to be the secretary of the Booker T. Washington. We'll talk about that later. But I went to them and inveigled them to get me a press pass so that I can get on the boat and chase Woodrow Wilson across the waters into France. And I got the press pass, but I needed money to pay for my boat ride. So I told the NAACP that they needed me to go over there and begin to write the history of the Negro in combat. They bought it, and they gave me $2,000. And in February 1919, I got on the boat and chased Woodrow Wilson across the water, going over to watch him. And I had another purpose as well. We're also organizing a Pan-African Congress. And I wanted to go over and participate in the Pan-African Congress. The Pan-African Congress was the first in 1919. In 1900, I had attended a Pan-African conference. I wrote a little essay early on in my career about the problem of the 20th century being the problem of the color line. And people thought all I meant was race prejudice in the United States of America. That is not all I meant at all. What I had noticed was that in every major war and conflagration around the nation, the place where the wars were mostly fought were in the land where people of color lived. In Africa, in Asia, in Central and South America, in Cuba, in the Philippines, even in the Balkan countries. But mostly, the major nations didn't have much conflagration. And so my analysis early on, at the turn of the century, was that the problem is the color line. And so in 1900, going over there for the Pan-African Peace Conference was for us to sit down and discuss how are we going to civilize the world in understanding that the vast majority of the people in the world, to include the yellow people in China and Japan, are people of color, and therefore the vast majority of the people of the world need to be brought to the table. And so in 1919, we're having the first Pan-African Congress, and so that was my third reason for going over. But why am I talking about the aftermath of the war? Why was I involved in the war in the first place? I'm an editor of the Crisis magazine. Well, in years before the war, there was the election of Woodrow Wilson, the first election in 1912. And didn't many Negroes have the right to vote? The ones in the North, some in the North did, about 500,000 of us, but in the South, none of them did. And so the entire time of our battle here in this beginning of the century was fighting to be recognized as human beings, fighting to be recognized as members of the constitutional legacy, the one that the founding fathers had laid out, that said all men are created equal, that said we the people. So we were fighting hard just to be included in the normal, everyday respect and dignity of the ordinary citizen. And so when the time came for this election in 1912, we had a double consciousness. And you'll notice that I wrote about this quite a lot, that the Negro was always had a double consciousness, one as an American and the other as a Negro. And we were never allowed to forget it. Whenever anybody was talking about America, the Negro was not automatically included. And people wondered, well, why are you excluding yourself? Well, we're not excluding ourselves. We have been excluded. We are trying to be the included ones. But we had this double consciousness. And the election brought it to fore. Here we had Woodrow Wilson running for election. And he was a Democrat. And we had him running against Eugene Debs, who was a socialist, and we had him running against Teddy Roosevelt and some other people. But our choices were basically Teddy Roosevelt, Eugene Debs, or Woodrow Wilson. I liked Teddy Roosevelt. We liked Teddy Roosevelt because when he was president 2 terms before, he had done well by the Negro. First of all, he had Booker T. Washington to dinner at the White House, for which he paid a price. But more than that, he passed some laws and hired some people on his staff of Negro who actually began to bring us into the civility, circle of civility. But then in 1906, down in Brownsville, Texas, conflagration occurred. There were some Negro soldiers in Brownsville who were in their barracks who had ridden with Teddy Roosevelt in the Philippines, at San Juan Hill, and purging in the Philippines. And some of them were bivouacked right here in the barracks at Brownsville, Texas. And somebody went out and shot up the neighborhood. And they, the mayor and other people, claimed that those soldiers did it. Well, their officer in charge of them was a major who was white. And he came out and he said, my soldiers didn't do that. Their weapons are locked up in the armory and they can't get them, and all the bullets are locked up in someplace else, and say they can't get it. No charges were conferred. The Texas Rangers came and investigated. There were investigations. Nobody was charged, and yet this thing went all the way up to Teddy Roosevelt. And he caused 167 of those soldiers to be summarily discharged without their pension, many of whom were eligible for pension. He had their pensions taken away from them. He forbade their ability to re-enlist and serve time. And then he made it impossible for them to be hired as a government worker. 167. And so when it came time for us to make a decision between Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, I decided to support Woodrow Wilson. Somebody had come and asked me, a bishop who worked with him came and told us that he had promised that he would do a platform, and he had written into his platform that no president could ever do as well by the Negro as he would. And so I wrote in the crisis that we should support Woodrow Wilson, and he won. And when he won, I sent him this letter. Sir, your inauguration to the presidency of the United States is to the colored people, to the white South, and to the nation a momentous occasion. For the first time since emancipation of slaves, the government of this nation, the presidency, the Senate, the House of Representatives, passes on the 4th of March into the hands of the party which a half-century ago fought desperately to keep black men as real estate in the eyes of the law. Your elevation to the chief magistracy of the nation at this time shows not simply a splendid faith in the perpetuity of free government, but even more, a personal faith in you. We, black men, by our votes, help to put you in your high position. It is true that in your overwhelming triumph at the polls that you might have succeeded without our aid. But the fact remains that our votes helped elect you this time, and that the time may easily come in the near future when without our 500,000 ballots, neither you nor your party can control the government. True as this is, we would not be misunderstood. We do not ask or expect special consideration or treatment in return for our franchises. We did not vote for you or your party because you represented our best judgment. It was not because we loved Democrats more, but Republicans less, and Roosevelt least. But that led to our action. That was in March 1913, just before the inauguration. This was in September of 1913. Sir, you have now been President of the United States for 6 months, and what is the result? It is no exaggeration to say that every enemy of the Negro race is greatly encouraged, that every man who dreams of making the Negro race a group of menials and pariahs is alert and hopeful. Vardaman, Tillman, Hoke Smith, Cole Blease, and Burleson are evidently assuming that their theory of the place and destiny of the Negro race is the theory of your administration. They and others are assuming this because not a single act and not a single word of yours since election has given anyone reason to infer that you have the slightest interest in the colored people or desire to alleviate the intolerable position. A dozen worthy Negro officials have been removed from office. And you have nominated but one black man, and he such a contemptible cur that this very nomination was an insult to every Negro in the land. To this negative appearance of indifference has been added positive action on the part of your advisors with or without your knowledge, which constitutes the gravest attack on liberties of our people since emancipation. Public segregation of civil service and government employ, necessarily involving personal insult and humiliation, has for the first time become public policy of the government. In the Treasury, the Post Office Department's colored clerks have been herded to themselves as though they were not human beings. We are told that one colored clerk who could not actually be segregated on account of the nature of his work has consequently had a cage built around him to separate him from his white companions of many years. Mr. Wilson, do you know these things? Are you responsible for them? Did you advise them? Do you know that no other American citizen has ever been treated in this way, and that no president of the United States ever dared to propose such treatment? Here is a plain, flat, disgraceful spitting in the face of a people whose darkened countenances are already dark with the slime of insult. Do you consent to this, President Wilson? Do you believe in it? Have you been able to persuade yourself that national insult is best for a people struggling for self-respect? We were struggling for self-respect through an organization called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. I insisted that the word be colored people and not Africans or Negro or blacks, not because of any disparagement about those names, but because we wanted to be inclusive of this whole notion that I mentioned earlier about the color line. We wanted to make sure that people understood that this fight was not just an exclusive fight for our individual personal liberties, but for the world. We also clearly understood that until we fixed the problem with the color line around the world, we were not going to fix the problem of the color prejudice here in the nation. they were not just related, they were married. The reason for the oppression of Negroes in the country was to satisfy the oppression of colonization. And so, in 1905, I was involved in creating the organization that turned out to be the precursor to the NAACP. It was called the Niagara Movement. Now, I was involved because I had been writing all along about these conditions that we're talking about and getting nowhere. And so I knew that the reason I was getting nowhere is because it was me and some of us individuals fighting individually against a machine that Mr. Booker T. Washington had at Tuskegee. We call it even the Tuskegee machine. Now, you need to understand that Mr. Booker T. Washington was a well-respected man. From me, I thought he was one of the most dynamic leaders since Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass died in 1895. But in that same year, Mr. Booker T. Washington went to a cotton exposition in Atlanta, Georgia, and he got up and he made a speech to the Southern oligarchy saying that in all matters purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, but in matters of mutual progress, one as the fist. And I wrote to him and told him that what a wonderful letter that was. Now, I was not a leader. I was just coming out of school and going into Wilberforce. But I wrote him, as other leaders did, telling him what a magnificent first move, because we anticipated that this was the first move in a chess game that he was playing with the Southern leaders, and that they would in turn return the favor and come back and offer something like the vote. But no, Mr. Booker T. Washington went on and basically proposed that we don't need political power right now. That can come. We don't need higher education right now. That can come. We don't need equal pay or pay that is commensurate with our labor. That can come. Right now, we'll cast down our buckets where we are. And we said, no. No, we won't. We need men and women, but then it was men who are talented, who are educated, who are thinkers, who are imaginative, and who are creative. Because without that, you have nobody who can lead us out of the wilderness. That is the whole plan of slavery, was to keep everybody out of the mainstream of knowledge. And if you had nobody to lead, then nobody would. And so we needed this organization, and so we went up to New York, Niagara, and went over to the Niagara part of Canada and held this meeting and created this group called the Niagara Movement. And the next year we went down to Harper's Ferry and met down there where John Brown had staged his assault. But by 1909, the Niagara Movement had proven that it was no match for the Tuskegee machine. Mr. Booker T. Washington still had command of the nation, of colored people in the nation, and many white people to include in the South. If Booker T. Washington told the president, especially with Roosevelt and Taft, if he said to them, don't appoint this white Southerner, they would not appoint him. That's the kind of power he had at the Tuskegee machine. And so our little movement was no match for that. But in 1909, they were having a big celebration in Springfield, Illinois, celebrating Abraham Lincoln's 100th birthday, and there was a lynching. Somebody came and lynched a Negro in that space to mar that celebration. And that got to dander up an awful lot of people, not the least of which was several of the liberal financiers and philanthropists who called a meeting together and invited us who were in the Niagara movement, and we met up at Joel Spingarn's place up in the Berkshires and met up there for 3 days, and out of that came the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and I became the editor of the Crisis magazine, and that was in 1910. And the reason I was in that position is because of my stance against Mr. Booker T. Washington, basically saying that we don't need men who cannot vote. We don't need people who cannot aspire to higher things. Look, understand something. What the nation had done was taken the slave codes, the limits that they had placed on people in slavery, brushed them off, took out the name slave, and put them as the black codes during Reconstruction. When Reconstruction was destroyed by their assault and attacks with the Ku Klux Klan, they brushed those off again and made them the Jim Crow codes. So every time the Negro fights and changes his status and condition, they brush off those limits. The limits have to do with education. They have to do with freedom of movement. They have to do with labor. They have to do with how much money you can make. They have to do with marriage. They have to do with citizenship. These are all limits that in the law they put on the books to actually limit the environment in which our people could grow up. If you grow up in a limited environment, what do you expect? How do I know this? Because in 1903, I did a study called the Philadelphia Negro, in which I went and studied the Negroes in the community. I was curious. What in the world is it with this crime? What in the world is it with these people not wanting to be educated? Why do they? And I found out it was not so. I knew it was not so. I just used my sociological and statistical methods to prove it was not so. I did the same thing in Atlanta, at Atlanta University. After I left Wilberforce and University of Pennsylvania, went to Atlanta University, I had 10 volumes of studies that people are still using today to analyze the conditions of the Negroes who live in the city. And so that is how I came to be in this position. And now, how did I get there myself? I grew up in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. I was born in 1868. I was born 3 years after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, 3 years after the end of the Civil War, the year that Johnson was impeached, the year that Reconstruction started. And so I was a child of Reconstruction. Growing up in Great Barrington, I had some experience with democracy. We'd have town hall meetings like this, and people would come out, and it was integrated. The Negroes and the whites would come, everybody would come. And there was one guy who was always coming. His name was Beartown Beebe. And Beartown Beebe lived up in the hills, and he always came down all scraggly and smelly. He came once a year and sat very prominently in the audience and waited his time to speak. And when he was called upon, he'd harangue the gathering about the allocation of money for the schools. He did not want them to allocate money for the schools. Didn't think education was necessary. He was doing all right. Well, year after year, I'm listening to this. I got tired of Beartown Beebe, and I said, why didn't somebody tell that old man to sit down and shut up? My principal, Mr. Hosman, looked over and he said, no, son, that's not the way we do things here. He said, see, democracy means you have to tolerate everybody's contribution. Let them have their say. Hear them out. And then when it comes time to vote, you vote your conscience. That stuck with me. And so when I left Great Barrington, I wanted to go to Harvard to extend my learning. Mr. Hosman said, no, you need to go to Fisk first. And it was the best thing that happened because I did not know that there were so many Negroes in the world that had ambition. I thought I was the only one, or maybe one of two or three. And that was one of my prideful moments. But I got down to Fisk, and I was amazed. And I studied there sociology and got my degree, and then went to Harvard. And Harvard would not accept all my credits from Fisk, and so I had to get another bachelor's degree at Harvard, but that was all right. Let me make this short. I went through and got my doctorate at Harvard. But I wanted to, the thing at the time was to study in Europe. And I was going to apply. I applied for a scholarship. The Slater Fund had a scholarship for Negroes to study overseas in Europe. And I applied and was turned down. A whole lot of my friends were as well. Rutherford B. Hayes, the former president of the United States, who pulled the federal troops out of the South at Reconstruction, was also the president and chairman of the Slater Fund. And he had gone down to Johns Hopkins and made a darky joke about trying to find Negroes who could qualify for these scholarships, and he could only find orators. Now, what insulted me was that my roommate had been elected the year before as the #1 orator at Harvard College. And so I sat down and wrote him a letter and said to him, we don't need you out here insulting us. If you're going to be our friends, we got enough enemies out here insulting us. We want to know what you say, what you plan to do with the money. We applied for that money, and then you came back and told us it was no longer available. And I told him that I don't need you to help me get an education. I can fight for my own education. But we do wonder why it is that every time a Negro tries to rise up, that our friends as well as our enemies go out of their way to press them down again. Well, the president invited me to New York to have a conversation with the committee. And I went up and had a conversation with the committee, and when I walked out, I bought me a new shirt headed for Europe to study at Humboldt University in Berlin, in which I studied economics. And I would have gotten my degree, my doctorate there. But would you know that the European universities did not accept my credits from Harvard? I tell you that because out of that, I began to teach at Wilberforce and write and study. And I had a scientific mind, and I had written, when I was in Europe studying, I sat down and wrote one night that I am going to write and make a name for myself in science and literature, and maybe build a visible empire in Africa. And if I perish, I perish. From that day on, I became the most diligent worker anywhere, because I understood that if you didn't have your facts right, even if you did have them right, you still had to get in the door. But you had to make sure that people, when you got in, recognized your ability. And so I was very meticulous and very diligent in my work, in my study, in my scientific analyses. And when I made a mistake or could not complete my research, I tried to always make it known that this is the best that I could do. I was not allowed to go into the Library of Congress and research the documents because of the color of my skin. So what you have here in my book called The Black Reconstruction is the best information that I could collect at the time. And so when I wrote The Souls of Black Folk, I didn't write it as one book. I had written a series and a collection of articles for the Crisis, for various magazines, Harper's and Atlantic Monthly and so on. But in 1905, Mr. Booker T. Washington published his book, Up From Slavery. And in that book, one of the things he recapitulated was his limits on the Negro aspirations. And my friend said, you need to put together a book. And so we sat down and we put together these articles. We put a cover on them. We call them The Souls of Black Folk. And that is a book that I am commending to your reading, because in there we talk an awful lot about the various things: the damnation of women, the souls of white folk. We talk about the Negro in the Army. Now, since this is about World War I started out by telling you what the Negro did in World War I and what was going on after the war. The last thing I will tell you is about what was happening in February, while I was over in Europe. The 369th Regiment was part of the 93rd Division. In the war, the Negroes that I had inspired to go join the Army, 700,000 of them showed up, but of that group, only a few, about 20,000, were allowed to fight, and they were not allowed to fight in combat under the American flag. Those soldiers under the American flag were there as stevedores and laborers and chefs and cooks, in fact, slaves. But the ones who fought valiantly, bravely, and they won the Croix de Guerre from France. And so in February, they were marching up Fifth Avenue, the 369th. They called them the Harlem Hellfighters, and they were marching and celebrating. 250,000 people lined the streets, celebrating their victory, where just a small number of those who were allowed in the combat had shown themselves brave. And so, what ensued thereafter was a renaissance of art and literature and culture and music that changed the Negro in America. You need to understand that our nation was trying to keep the Negro in a position of servitude, and it was only that period that we're speaking now in which we burst through and start a flowering of art and culture and social order that really began to make us a part of the United States of America. I thank you so very much for your attention. Thank you.
Hello, we're back, and thanks for staying with us. I'm here with Bill Grimmette, who has just performed as W.E.B. Du Bois. Thank you for coming back to Montgomery College.
Well, you're welcome, and thanks for inviting me.
You were here with Du Bois in 1999, quite a few years ago. How has your performance of him changed since then?
Well, then I had more hair, and I needed less, and I had less facial hair, and I needed more. So I wore this god-awful mustache, painted, plastered on, and I was spending more time trying to hold it on. Now I have less hair, which I need, so I just shaved a few strands off, and my beard and mustache conforms. But technically, I also, my performance this time followed a theme because it was World War I, and I started him talking about the conditions around that point. Because what I did the first time was I started him at his birth. And by the time I got him out of college, my time was almost gone. So that's what is different now. Yeah.
What have you learned from Du Bois and performing him so often, or for so many years? What have you learned from him?
That you are always learning from him. You can read the same article or the same that he written for the Crisis magazine 3 times, and you get 3 different impressions from it. You need to really read him, with an open mind to understand the complexities that he was dealing with and that he was speaking about, because he was so well trained, he was so well educated, he was so thoroughly traveled that he was bringing into his insight and a lot of things that ordinary people don't know. And you won't know it until you go back to him when he wrote his autobiography at 90 years old, looking back over his life. It became clear to me that he was talking about something slightly different than what I had assumed. And so I'm always learning from him, always.
And he was so prolific, as you mentioned.
Oh, yes.
In the question and
he
answer
wrote
section.
30 different books. He wrote novels, he wrote poems, he wrote songs, he wrote a play, The Star of Ethiopia, that he took around as a pageant to different places. And then he wrote The Black Reconstruction, The Souls of Black Folks, 3 autobiographies, and it's just an amazing array of things. Plus, all the articles that he wrote for The Crisis and various magazines, Harper's Magazine and The Atlantic Monthly and many other magazines, plus what he was writing for colleges and universities in his studies. He had 10 volumes of studies that he had done on the Negro when he was at Atlanta University between 1900 and 1906.
In preparation for this, because I knew you were coming as W.E.B. Du Bois, I read The Souls of Black Folks, and it's a marvelous book. Information that I hadn't thought of, information that I thought I knew, put in a different context. I was trying to describe his writing style. Eloquent doesn't really get to it. Lyrical doesn't really get to it, but it's different. It's very special.
Yeah, it's scientific, literary, artistic, and something else. I think you said lyrical, which is different from literary, all into one. And one has to be real careful, or you'll miss the point by getting hung up behind his words.
I probably need to read it again.
Yeah.
I found that I really enjoyed his scholarship in his writing style. You can tell that he's coming from a bit of a scientific background with the numbers when he was talking about Reconstruction, the Freedmen's Bureau. He had the numbers of population and the dollars. And so that sociology background really helped him also create something extremely unique.
Yeah, he was determined to use science as the basis of all of his thought. He said, art is propaganda. He said, and I don't give a hoot about art that is not propaganda. So that's what you sell. You use that to affect people's beliefs. But in science, it's based on fact. And fact, you got to have the numbers. You got to be able to go out and look and see before you can tell people this happened, you know. And so this is unique.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. He also talked about the Freedmen's Bureau in that particular book and their attempts, their successes, and the failures. Yeah. And that was also interesting reading.
Well, it's a fascinating thing. What he's basically telling us is that this was a bureau. Again, here's that science and propaganda. They tell you that it's there for one thing, but they don't fund it. They give it no money. Frederick Douglass had to come in and use his own money to keep it alive when everybody knew it was dying. And so when he goes through and looks, you know, people have said that, but no, they didn't have the statistics. They didn't have the scientific analysis to make the statement that this was deliberately scuttled. Then he showed, on the one hand, where everybody knew that it took more money than they actually planned to give it. They knew that going in. So therefore they knew that it couldn't work. They said, well, we're going to let the people put their pennies up and to sustain it. He said, but you're not paying them any pennies. You know, where are they going to get these pennies from? And so it's a remarkable thing that he was very good at analyzing things from a scientific point of view.
He was sometimes called by different people the father of the civil rights movement. Did he see himself that way?
I would say yes and no. I don't see that he ever called himself that, but they called him the father of the civil rights movement, the father of history, and the father of a lot of different things, because he was at least the first one to articulate the arguments that the civil rights movement even uses to this very day. He was there writing for the Crisis when Story, the first lawyer, took the cases to the Supreme Court. And so if you asked him, and later on in life, if that was something he would call himself, he would probably say no, because I don't like those kind of appellations. But if you were talking about the things that I did, then you have your own label you put on it.
He really sort of hit the nail on the head when he started talking about disenfranchisement and the need for political leverage.
Yes.
That's really important, and that's the thing that Booker T. Washington didn't talk about, political leverage.
Right.
And so they're the separation.
Well, yeah, Booker T. Washington, Du Bois said Booker T. Washington was not wrong. You got to start where you are. He said he was incomplete. He said he didn't realize that the South had no intention of doing anything different from what they were doing. When he made his proposal, they had no intention of countering that with a better offer. They thanked him, they gave him awards, they patted him on the head and said thank you, and we keep on doing it. But that was not just the Southerners, that was also the Northern Philanthropic Society, the financiers, the Andrew Carnegies of the world, the Mellons. They were also in support of the labor, because they didn't want to pay much for labor. So they were in charge, and they were actually funding Booker T. Washington. He tells that story.
Du Bois, being a Northerner, had a very different perspective and was able to see the stark contrast from what he experienced in the North, whether education or just in his town where the town meetings were integrated. When he got to the South, he could see something completely different, and it probably was so stark that sparked him writing about it, studying it, and saying something needs to be done about this.
Well, yes,
this activism.
When his first year in college, they had to go out to teach in the summer and summer vacation, and in order to go to teach, you had to walk through the mountains and find your own school. And so he was walking through the mountains his first year, and you walk through the mountains. You say, "Got a teacher?" They say, "Nope." "Want one?" "Nope." You keep walking. And until you find somebody who says yes. So he found Josie, this 13-year-old, and all of her little siblings, and that became his school. And what he learned there was the eagerness of these people in these mountains, in these conditions, to know, to learn. And that's what got his attention. That's what showed him the stark difference between how he grew up in the mountains, in the Berkshires, right? And how the people in the mountains live who, after slavery, who were just thrown to the winds and given nothing to sustain themselves. Not only given nothing, but everything else they might have gotten was taken away and denied them. So when he saw that, when he got to the South, he got to Fisk and noticed that there was a stark difference in the personality of the students at Fisk. That they were at Fisk, and they were the creme de la creme, but they were also treating themselves as inferiors because of that double consciousness. And so he said he learned an awful lot about this relationship.
Could you talk a little bit more about the concept of knowing and believing? You talked about it with the audience in the auditorium, but the TV audience might not have heard as much about it as they'd like.
Yeah, what he's basically saying is that in the propaganda of history, the propaganda of everything, that what you're doing is you're selling people on something that is not necessarily true, right? That's what propaganda means. The facts and knowledge is one thing, but in order to sell it and make people believe, then you got to paint a different picture. And so his whole notion about propaganda of history and the propaganda of war is that war is what you're fighting the war for one reason, and the generals know what that reason is. But the people, in order to join and to support that fight, must believe is something else, right? And that's what you have to discern from his writings, that the propaganda of history and the propaganda of war means that I've got to get you to believe something different from what you know in order to get you to support it, right? And that's what basically democracy is. And that's what politicians do, he says. They know what they can and cannot do, but they got to get you to believe that they are going to do something that they actually have no intention of doing. And so when you when you distill it down, those are the juxtaposed issues that he's talking about. What you know and what you're led to believe. Even the Constitution. He says the Constitution was written, and it's one thing, but in order to sell it, they wrote these papers on the side and took it out and tried to sell people on that it was something else. And so, yeah.
We have 2 minutes left, and I want to talk to you a little bit about in World War I, he wrote the closed ranks because he wanted African Americans to support the war effort to join, and they did.
Yeah.
Was he criticized for that?
Oh yes. Oh yeah. Most people, even he was anti-war, and most of the civil rights leaders, and especially most of his socialist friends, did not agree with him at all, and so he had to step out on a limb in order to do that. And then later, he regretted doing it himself. But he had a good point. He said the war was, we knew what the war was about, at least he did, but the war was pitched as the war to make the world safe for democracy. And he said, now with a propaganda like that, you can't, and you want democracy, you want the franchise, you have to join up, because if you don't, then they're going to say, when we were fighting for democracy, you did not join. Yes. So it was one of the things where he didn't really have a choice. He thought he did, and everybody says, you got a choice. But he said, I didn't really have a choice in this. That because if we had not fought, then we would have been criticized for not fighting.
Correct. And fought valiantly, they did.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here. We hope to see you as another character not too far in the distant future. It's been wonderful having you here.
Well, it's been great to be here. Thank you so much, Angela.
You're welcome. And thank you for joining us. You've been watching Chautauqua, Voices from the Great War. I'm Angela Rice Beamer at the Germantown campus of Montgomery College. Good night.